Time and the Other by Emmanuel Levinas quotes, Time and the Other by Emmanuel Levinas presents a philosophical exploration of the relationship between time, existence, and the other. Levinas challenges traditional notions of existence by introducing the concept of existing without existence, where existence is viewed independently of specific entities. He also delves into the nature of solitude, freedom, and materiality, highlighting the fundamental loneliness of the self and its struggle with being. Levinas uses concepts such as hypostasis and the there is to illustrate how time is intertwined with the self's encounter with the other, ultimately emphasizing that authentic temporality is tied to relationships rather than individual isolation. Quote 1. Time is not the achievement of an isolated and lone subject, but that it is the very relationship of the subject with the other. Levinas emphasizes that time cannot be understood in isolation. It is fundamentally relational, emerging through interaction with others. This suggests that human existence, when understood through time, is intertwined with the presence of others, not merely an individual experience or concept. Quote 2. Solitude as a category of being, to show the place of solitude in the general economy of being. Solitude, for Levinas, is not just a psychological state, but an existential category. He aims to situate solitude within the broader framework of existence, highlighting how solitude plays a role in shaping the human condition, beyond social or psychological interpretations. Quote 3. Being is not an empty notion, that it has its own dialectic. Here, Levinas argues that existence is not a hollow or abstract idea. Rather, it has its own dynamic process. This dialectic refers to the way being constantly evolves and shifts through interactions and contradictions, which can reveal deeper truths about existence. Quote 4. Existing resists every relationship and multiplicity. Levinas notes that existence itself cannot be fully captured by relationships or plurality. While we engage with others and the world around us, at the core, existence remains singular and indivisible, resisting any attempt to merge completely with other beings or ideas. Quote 5. The fact of existing imposes itself when there is no longer anything. Levinas introduces the idea that existence itself is undeniable and persists even when everything else disappears. This describes the inevitability and permanence of being, which continues to exist even in the absence of objects or people. Quote 6. Solitude therefore appears neither as the factual isolation of a Robinson Crusoe, nor as the incommunicability of a content of consciousness, but as the indissoluble unity between the existent and its work of existing. Levinas differentiates between common notions of solitude, such as physical isolation or unshared inner thoughts, and what he views as the deeper reality. Solitude is the unbreakable bond between a person and their act of existing. This unity defines a more profound form of solitude beyond mere separateness. Quote 7. In ecstasis, the subject is absorbed in the object and recovers itself in its unity. Levinas critiques the concept of ecstasy, where the subject seemingly transcends and fuses with the object but ultimately returns to itself. He suggests that this process negates true duality, as it merely reaffirms the subject's original unity rather than maintaining a genuine encounter with the other. Quote 8. I am not the other. I am all alone. This emphasizes the inherent separateness of individuals. Despite being surrounded by others or engaging with them, each person retains their distinct existence. This existential isolation persists, no matter how interconnected one might seem. Quote 9. In evoking the anonymity of this existing, I am not at all thinking of the indeterminate ground. This indeterminate ground is already a being. Levinas clarifies that when he speaks of the anonymous nature of existence, he is not referring to a vague or undifferentiated entity. Rather, he is pointing to the very act of existing itself, which precedes any categorization or identification as a being. This distinction is crucial in understanding his philosophy of existence. Quote 10. This existing is not an in itself, en soi, which is already peace. It is precisely the absence of all self, a without self, sans soi. Levinas suggests that this form of existence is not self-contained or peaceful, as it lacks the essence of self. This without self existence is a state of pure being that does not rest in a stable identity, but instead remains without the definition or closure that selfhood would imply. Quote 11. Eternity is not appeased because it does not have a subject that takes it upon itself. Eternity, for Levinas, cannot be calmed or resolved because it lacks a central subject to claim or contain it. Eternity stands apart from subjectivity, and as such, it exists in an ungraspable state, forever out of reach of human attempts to master or understand it fully. Quote 12. The eternal subject not only cannot begin anything outside itself, it is impossible in itself, for as a subject, it would have to be a beginning and exclude eternity. Levinas points out the contradiction in the notion of an eternal subject. A subject inherently requires a beginning, but eternity, by its nature, has no starting point. Therefore, an eternal subject is a logical impossibility, as subjectivity and eternity are incompatible concepts. Quote 13. Suicide appears as the final recourse against the absurd. Here, Levinas highlights the tragic notion that in the face of absurdity, suicide seems to offer an escape. However, this act is not necessarily a solution, but a recognition of the individual's inability to master or find meaning within the absurd condition of existence. Quote 14. The notion of irremissible being, without exit, constitutes the fundamental absurdity of being. Levinas asserts that the core absurdity of existence lies in its inescapability. Being is not something from which one can simply withdraw or avoid. It persists relentlessly without offering a true way out, which amplifies the absurdity and anxiety that accompanies it. Hypostate. Quote 15. Basis is freedom. The existent is master of existing. It exerts on its existence the virile power of the subject. Levinas equates hypostasis, the grounding of being, with a form of freedom. The existent, by existing, exerts control over its own being, displaying a powerful mastery. This freedom is tied to the very act of existing, reflecting an existential sovereignty that each being holds. Quote 16. Solitude is thus not only a despair and an abandonment, but also a virility, a pride, and a sovereignty. Levinas offers a redefinition of solitude, suggesting that it is not merely a state of despair or isolation. Instead, solitude contains an inherent strength, pride, and sovereignty, as it signifies the subject's mastery over its own existence, independent of any external relations. Quote 17. Materiality accompanies, necessarily, the upsurge of the subject in its existent freedom. For Levinas, the material aspect of existence is inseparable from the subject's rise into being. Materiality is not a burden or a fall from spirit, but a necessary condition that comes with the subject's freedom, anchoring the abstract notion of freedom in the physical realm. Quote 18. Solitude is not tragic because it is the privation of the other, but because it is shut up within the captivity of its identity, because it is matter. Levinas clarifies that the tragedy of solitude lies not in the absence of others, but in the subject's entrapment within its own identity. This captivity is linked to materiality, which binds the subject to itself, making solitude a self-contained, isolating experience. Quote 19. Matter is the misfortune malheur of hypostasis. Levinas links materiality with a kind of existential misfortune, stating that matter binds us to a fundamental solitude. This solitude is not an occasional or higher-level anxiety, but is intertwined with the everyday existence that constantly wrestles with the material conditions of life. Quote 20. The feeling of solitude persists and threatens in the very midst of the optimistic constructivism of sociology and socialism. Even in the most optimistic social frameworks that aim to create a better society, the sense of existential solitude endures. Levinas emphasizes that despite collective efforts to improve human conditions, solitude remains a powerful undercurrent that threatens the seeming happiness of social life. Quote 21. Everyday life is a preoccupation with salvation. Levinas suggests that the mundane routines of everyday existence, far from being trivial or inauthentic, are deeply connected to the human concern for salvation. Everyday actions and material concerns are attempts to respond to the deeper anxieties and sufferings that accompany our existence. Quote 22. The fool is not the tempest that extinguishes the lights and tears away the curtains. In this metaphor, Levinas uses the figure of the Shakespearean fool to represent someone who speaks truths about the absurdity of life without taking on the heroic role of confronting or overcoming that absurdity. The fool observes and comments but remains outside the central action, highlighting the absurdity without resolving it. Quote 23. The solitude of the existent, which constitutes the tragedy of solitude, is materiality. Levinas argues that the true tragedy of human solitude stems from materiality, the very substance of being. This solitude is not due to the absence of others, but because of the inescapable fact that existence ties individuals to themselves, weighed down by their material presence. Quote 24. The uttermost finality of eating is contained in food. Here, Levinas presents a reflection on the act of eating as a form of enjoyment and fulfillment. He suggests that the final purpose of eating lies within the act itself, not in some external goal, which highlights the inherent satisfaction that comes from direct material engagement with the world. Quote 25. The subject is in space, at a distance from all the objects that are necessary for its existence. Levinas explores the relationship between the subject and the world, emphasizing that while the subject depends on material objects for existence, it remains distanced from them. This distance allows the subject to engage with the world without being fully absorbed or defined by it. Quote 26. Light is that through which something is other than myself, but already, as if it came from me. Levinas reflects on the role of light in perception, suggesting that light creates the distinction between the self and the world, while simultaneously giving the world a sense of familiarity. The illuminated world feels as if it originates from the self, bridging the gap between self and other in a unique way. Quote 27. The solitude of the subject results from its relationship with the existing over which it is master. Levinas argues that the subject's solitude arises from its mastery over its own existence. This solitude is not a matter of lacking companionship, but stems from the subject's relationship with its own act of being, where it begins from itself, not to act or think, but simply to exist. Quote 28. In work, meaning, in effort, in its pain and sorrow, the subject finds the weight of the existence, which involves its existent freedom itself. Levinas explains that, through the labor and effort involved in work, the subject experiences the burden of existence. Work brings the subject into contact with the harsh reality of existence, which is marked by pain and sorrow, emphasizing the solitude and responsibility tied to individual freedom. Quote 29. The content of suffering merges with the impossibility of detaching oneself from suffering. Levinas describes suffering as an experience in which the subject cannot escape. Suffering becomes a total engagement with existence, where the inability to detach from the experience of pain highlights the irremissibility of being itself. Quote 30. Death as mystery contrasts strongly with experience thus understood. Levinas contrasts death with any form of experience that can be understood through knowledge or light. Death, in its mystery, eludes the typical patterns of understanding, remaining outside the realm of conscious mastery and revealing itself as an event that cannot be assimilated or controlled. Quote 31. Death is never a present. Levinas points out that death is not something that can be experienced in the present. It always exists in the future, outside the grasp of the subject's mastery over time and existence. Death remains eternally out of reach, as it cannot be fully encountered within the limits of the present moment. Quote 32. Hope is in the very margin that is given, at the moment of death, to the subject who is going to die. Levinas highlights the paradox of hope at the moment of death. Even as death approaches, there remains a margin for hope, as the subject still glimpses a last chance, refusing to fully assume death and maintaining the possibility of existence even in the face of its end. Quote 33. In death, the existing of the existent is alienated. Levinas emphasizes that in death, the subject's existence becomes estranged from itself. The subject loses its grip over its being, as death introduces a radical otherness that breaks the subject's solitary control over its own existence, bringing a profound disruption to its autonomy. Quote 34. The future is what is in no way grasped. The other is the future. Levinas draws a parallel between the future and the other. The future, like the other, cannot be grasped or fully anticipated. It represents an unknown and unpredictable force that cannot be mastered by the subject, making the relationship with the future akin to the relationship with the other. Quote 35. The future is not buried in the bowels of a pre-existent eternity, where we would come to lay hold of it. It is absolutely other and new. Levinas emphasizes that the future is not something that can be derived from the present or eternity. It represents a radical alterity, something entirely new and other, beyond any anticipation or control, marking the true essence of time as a break from the continuity of existence. Quote 36. The strangeness of the future of death does not leave the subject any initiative. Death, for Levinas, represents an event so foreign and strange that it strips the subject of any initiative or control. This radical lack of agency in the face of death highlights the ultimate passivity and powerlessness of the subject when confronted with its own mortality. Quote 37. The other as other is not only an alter ego. The other is what I myself am not. Levinas clarifies that the other is not simply a reflection or counterpart of the self. The other is radically different, representing an alterity that escapes any identification with the self. This absolute difference forms the foundation of the ethical relationship with the other. Quote 38. The relationship with alterity is neither spatial nor conceptual. Levinas argues that the relationship with the other is not something that can be explained by spatial or conceptual terms. It transcends physical distance or intellectual categories, existing as a more profound and enigmatic interaction that cannot be fully grasped by typical forms of understanding. Quote 39. Hiding is the way of existing of the feminine, and this fact of hiding is precisely modesty. Levinas introduces the idea that the feminine embodies a mode of being that withdraws from light and visibility. This withdrawal, which he associates with modesty, represents a unique form of transcendence, contrasting with the masculine tendency toward visibility and control. Quote 40. The caress is the anticipation of this pure future, without content. In describing the caress, Levinas portrays it as a gesture that seeks without knowing what it seeks. The caress anticipates the future as something unknown and unattainable, representing an engagement with an ever-elusive alterity that cannot be fully grasped or possessed. Quote 41. What one presents as the failure of communication in love precisely constitutes the positivity of the relationship. This absence of the other is precisely its presence as other. Levinas argues that the so-called failure of communication in love is not a flaw, but the very essence of the relationship. The absence of the other, the impossibility of fully knowing or possessing them, is what makes the other present as truly other, preserving their alterity and mystery. Quote 42. It is a collectivity that is not a communion. It is the face-to-face without intermediary, and is furnished for us in the eras where, in the other's proximity, distance is integrally maintained. Levinas defines a form of relationship that avoids fusion or communion, preserving the distance and individuality of each person. This face-to-face encounter maintains both proximity and separation, emphasizing a connection without absorption, where each remains distinctly other. Quote 43. The structure of a seeing having the seen for its object or theme, the so-called intentional structure, is found in all the modes of sensibility having access to things. Levinas argues that the structure of vision, in which an object is seen and apprehended, extends to all forms of sensibility and knowledge. This framework of intentionality shapes how we access, perceive, and interact with the world and others, anchoring thought and consciousness in the act of seeing as a model of knowledge. Quote 44. In thought understood as vision, knowledge, and intentionality, intelligibility thus signifies the reduction of the other, auteur, to the same. Levinas critiques the traditional model of knowledge and vision, which he claims reduces the otherness of things and people to a sameness within the ego. This form of knowledge assimilates the other into the self, failing to preserve its true alterity, and thus erases the uniqueness and difference that the other represents. Quote 45. Language can pass for interior discourse, and can always be attributed to the gathering of alterity into the unity of presence by the ego of the intentional I think. Here, Levinas reflects on language as something that can be reduced to a dialogue within the ego itself. Language, in this view, gathers the alterity of the other into the unity of the ego's thought, reinforcing the dominance of presence and reducing the other to something that can be represented and grasped by the self. Quote 46. Responsibility for the other signifies an original and concrete temporality, and that the universalization of presence presupposes it. Levinas introduces the idea that responsibility for the other is the foundation of time and temporality. This ethical relationship precedes the abstract concept of presence and universality, suggesting that the very fabric of time and knowledge is grounded in ethical responsibility toward others. Quote 47. The face of the other, under all the particular forms of expression where the other, already in a character's skin, plays a role, is just as much pure expression, an extradition without defense or cover. Levinas describes the face of the other as a form of pure expression, stripped of any defenses or coverings. This exposure reflects the vulnerability and mortality of the other, presenting the other in a way that demands ethical responsibility from the self, emphasizing the raw humanity that cannot be ignored. Quote 48. Responsibility for the other, the face signifying to me, thou shalt not kill, and consequently also, you are responsible for the life of this absolutely other, is responsibility for the unique one. Levinas emphasizes that the face of the other communicates a fundamental ethical demand, the responsibility to protect the life of the other. This responsibility is not abstract, but directed toward the unique, irreplaceable individual, underscoring the infinite obligation one holds toward the other. Quote 49. The relationship from the ego to the other is thus asymmetrical, without noematic correlation of any thematizable presence. Levinas highlights that the relationship between the self and the other is inherently asymmetrical. It does not involve mutual exchange or equivalence, but instead arises from a one-sided responsibility, where the self is called to respond to the other, without seeking to make the relationship reciprocal or balanced. Quote 50. The offense done to the other by being's good conscience is already an offense done to the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. Levinas critiques the self-assuredness of existence that, in its comfortable, good conscience, overlooks the ethical responsibility toward the vulnerable, those who are marginalized, such as the stranger, widow, and orphan. The mere act of existing can inadvertently contribute to the harm of others, particularly the most defenseless. Quote 51. It commands me to not remain indifferent to this death, to not let the other die alone, that is, to answer for the life of the other person. Levinas explains that the ethical command arising from the face of the other calls upon the self to take responsibility for the life of the other. This responsibility includes not allowing the other to die in isolation, but instead being accountable for their well-being, signifying the depth of the ethical obligation. Quote 52. Responsibility is anterior to deliberation, and is that to which I have thus been exposed and dedicated before being dedicated to myself. Levinas emphasizes that responsibility toward the other is not something that emerges after reflection or decision. It precedes all conscious deliberation. The individual is already bound to this responsibility even before being aware of their own self-interest or identity, making responsibility a fundamental aspect of existence. Quote 53. The past has the signification of an inveterate obligation, older than any engagement, taking the whole of its meaning in the imperative that commands the ego by way of the other's face. Levinas suggests that responsibility toward the other carries a significance that transcends any prior decisions or engagements. This obligation is rooted in a deep ethical commandment, symbolized by the other's face, which predates any conscious choices made by the self. Quote 54. Responsibility for the other, responding to the other's death, vows itself to an alterity that is no longer within the province of representation. Levinas speaks of an obligation to respond to the other's death, one that engages with an alterity beyond the realm of representation. This form of responsibility is a commitment to the absolute difference of the other, not reducible to any form of comprehension or representation. Quote 55. There is responsibility for the other, right up to dying for the other. Levinas underscores the profound nature of ethical responsibility, which extends even to the point of being willing to die for the other. This radical responsibility demonstrates the extreme demands placed on the self in relation to the other, signifying a complete dedication beyond personal survival. Quote 56. The subjection that precedes deliberation about an imperative measures, so to speak, or attests to, an infinite authority. Levinas points out that ethical responsibility is not derived from deliberation, but is a subjection to an infinite authority, which precedes all conscious decision-making. This authority represents the profound ethical command that governs human interactions, an obligation that arises without coercion. Quote 57. What seems, in fact, to be opened is the necessity to think time in the devotion of a theology without theodicy. Levinas proposes the idea of thinking about time through the lens of ethics and responsibility, rather than through a theological framework that justifies suffering, theodicy. This approach calls for a theology grounded in ethical devotion, where responsibility and care for others take precedence over metaphysical explanations. Quote 58. One desires renewal, independently of any error committed, unless the pure persistence in the same is not already an error. Levinas points out that the human desire for renewal exists even in the absence of mistakes or failures. The craving for newness might stem from the recognition that remaining stagnant or unchanged, persisting in the same, may in itself be a fundamental error in human existence. Quote 59. The desire for the new in us is a desire for the other. It distinguishes our being from existing, which is self-sufficient. Levinas suggests that the human desire for the new is essentially a desire for the other, which transcends mere existence. Unlike existence, which is self-contained and seeks to preserve itself, This desire opens individuals to something beyond themselves, marking the difference between being and simply existing. Quote 60. Absolute newness is instantaneous in the now, already labeled and already depreciated by the future horizon, by the future in view of a new, virtually newer than the new. Levinas observes that absolute newness is fleeting, existing only momentarily before it begins to fade. The instant something new arrives, it is already being diminished by the anticipation of something newer, making the experience of newness transient and unstable. Quote 61. The modern is constituted by the consciousness of a certain definitively acquired freedom. Levinas defines modernity as the awareness of a certain freedom that has been permanently obtained. In this modern view, nothing precedes freedom, allowing for limitless possibilities. Modernity thus sees itself as freed from the constraints of the past, living in the perpetual potential of the new. Quote 62. In passing beyond the sciences and perceptions, philosophy is guided by the idea of the totality of the real, of its truth beyond the old and the new. Levinas reflects on how philosophy seeks to transcend the limitations of scientific and perceptual knowledge. It strives to grasp the totality of reality, encompassing both the old and the new, in search of an absolute truth that integrates all aspects of existence into a unified understanding. Quote 63. One can ask if such a relation to newness conforms to the human desire for renewal, if, in the knowledge where novelty is dealt with, the other, the new, is still sought in its alterity. Levinas raises the question of whether the way modernity deals with newness truly fulfills the human desire for renewal. He wonders if, in our pursuit of knowledge, we are still seeking the other and the new in their true difference, or if we are merely assimilating them into familiar patterns, losing the essence of their alterity. Bergson is, quote 64. Brings to bear an inestimable message. It perceives the essential, in an unceasing passage to the other, which does not stop at any identity. Levinas praises Bergson for offering a profound insight into the nature of change. For Bergson, human experience is marked by continuous movement toward the other, without resting in any fixed identity, emphasizing a dynamic, ongoing transformation that resists stagnation. Quote 65. There is duration which is pure change, without rest and without return, the absolute unforeseeable. Levinas contrasts two concepts of time, the measurable, spatial time of everyday life, and the inner time of duration. In this inner time, there is pure, ongoing change that neither rests nor returns, embodying the unpredictable and unforeseeable nature of true temporal experience. Quote 66. The youth or unending spring of consciousness is for Bergson equivalent to the freedom of humankind's profound being. Levinas discusses Bergson's view of consciousness, likening it to a perpetual state of renewal and freedom. For Bergson, this unending vitality is the core of human existence, representing an ongoing process of creation and transformation that keeps human consciousness ever young and open to new possibilities. Quote 67. Intuition, bound up to a duration which is growth, perceives in it an uninterrupted continuity of unforeseeable novelty. Levinas emphasizes Bergson's concept of intuition as a way of perceiving time not as a series of static moments, but as an ongoing, continuous flow of change. This duration is marked by novelty that is always emerging, unpredictable, and constantly renewing itself, in contrast to the fixed structures of logical thought. Quote 68. Duration will be revealed as it is, unceasing creation, the uninterrupted upsurge of novelty. Levinas explains that Bergson sees duration as a process of constant creation. Rather than being something fixed or reducible to familiar elements, duration reveals itself through the emergence of continuous and unforeseen novelty, highlighting the dynamic nature of existence. Quote 69. The human would be the original place of rupture, and would have a metaphysical bearing. It would be the very advent of mind. Levinas suggests that humanity represents a fundamental break in the continuity of existence, acting as the site where mind or spirit emerges. This rupture has metaphysical significance, as it marks the point where the novelty of thought and consciousness arises, opening up new possibilities of being. Quote 70. Does the thought which relates to the new allow it to maintain its novelty and to stand the wear and tear? Levinas raises the question of whether thought, by engaging with novelty, compromises the very newness it seeks to understand. Once novelty is grasped by thought, it risks losing its freshness and becoming something familiar, raising the problem of whether true newness can be preserved in the realm of thought. Quote 71. My profoundest thought, which bears all thought, my thought of the infinite older than the thought of the finite, is the very diachrony of time, non-coincidence, dispossession itself. Levinas describes the idea of the infinite as being more fundamental than any thought of the finite. This thought of the infinite exists in the diachrony of time, a non-synchronous, disjointed flow that reflects dispossession rather than possession, standing as a deeper, more original dimension of existence. Quote 72. Responsibility is without concern for reciprocity. I have to respond to and for the other without occupying myself with the other's responsibility in my regard. Levinas stresses the ethical relationship as one-sided, where responsibility for the other does not depend on any expectation of reciprocity. This responsibility is purely for the sake of the other, without concern for whether the other reciprocates or responds to the self in return. Time and the Other, by Emmanuel Levinas, concludes by emphasizing that genuine existence is not realized in solitary self-sufficiency, but through the transcendence of the self towards the other. Levinas argues that time is fundamentally a relational experience, where the encounter with the other creates a future that cannot be absorbed by the self's mastery. The ethical dimension of the relationship with the other is highlighted as a break from solitude and the anonymity of existence, making time itself a manifestation of transcendence and connection beyond the self.
Curious to dive into the mind of Emmanuel Levinas? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Time and the Other in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.